Daniel Reyes thought he understood the geography of his own marriage. He didn't know that his wife had been living in a different country than he was, standing right beside him. Within 72 hours, everything he believed about the last 9 years would collapse into a single quiet truth. If stories about hidden truths and the moment a person finally sees clearly speak to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because the ending of this one is the part I most want you to stay for. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read them all, and I promise you'll want to be part of the conversation this story is going to start. It was a Tuesday in early autumn, the kind of gray morning when the airport swallows sound and gives back only the hum of rolling luggage and distant announcements. Daniel Reyes stood in the departures hall at Denver International with his wife, Marissa, and he was trying very hard to be a good husband. He carried both suitcases. He held her coffee while she checked her phone. He had woken at 4 in the morning to drive them here because Marissa hated arriving late, and Marissa arriving late was a storm he had learned over 9 years to prevent rather than weather. They were flying to Chicago, or so Daniel believed, for the wedding of Marissa's cousin. It was a family trip. He had bought the tickets 3 weeks earlier. Or rather, he had given Marissa the money to buy the tickets, because she managed those things, she said, more efficiently than he did. He was an architect, a quiet man who spent his days drawing the bones of buildings that other people would fill with their lives, and he had learned early in the marriage that Marissa preferred to handle the logistics of theirs. "You look tired," Marissa said, not unkindly but not warmly either. She had a way of stating observations as if they were minor disappointments. "Did you sleep?" "A little," Daniel said. "I'll sleep on the plane." She smiled at that, a small private smile that Daniel, in the moment, mistook for affection. He would understand later that it was something else entirely. They moved through the terminal together. Marissa walked half a step ahead, the way she always did, and Daniel followed, the way he always did. And if you had watched them, you might have read the whole shape of their marriage in those 6 feet of tile between them. She set the pace. He kept it. He had spent 9 years keeping her pace, adjusting his stride to hers, telling himself that this was what partnership looked like, that one person led and the others supported, and that there was no shame in being the one who supported. What Daniel did not know, standing there with 2 coffees and 2 suitcases, was that Marissa had not booked them on the same flight. What he did not know was that the second boarding pass in her purse did not have his name on it and did not go to Chicago. What he did not know was that the man she was actually meeting had checked into a hotel in a city Daniel had never heard her mention, and that the wedding invitation on the refrigerator at home was 3 years old, dug out and repurposed for exactly this morning. But that revelation was still hours away. First, there was the ordinary cruelty of an ordinary goodbye. They reached the security checkpoint. Marissa turned to him. She put her hand on his chest, a gesture that in the early years had made his heart lift and that now landed on him with the weight of routine. "You don't have to wait," she said. "You've got the client meeting at 10. Go. I'll text you when I land." Daniel hesitated. It nagged at him, faintly, that Marissa was so eager to send him away. Usually she wanted him to stay until the last possible second, wanted the small audience of his attention. But he told himself he was imagining a chill where there was only efficiency. That was a thing he told himself often. "I can wait until you're through," he offered. "Danny?" She said his name the way a teacher says the name of a student who has raised his hand at the wrong time. "Go. I'm a grown woman. I can get on a plane." So he leaned in and hugged her. She hugged him back, briefly, her arms light around his shoulders, and then she stepped away and joined the security line, and Daniel turned to leave. Here is the thing about instinct. It does not announce itself. It arrives as a small wrongness, a splinter in the smooth surface of a familiar morning. Daniel had taken perhaps 20 steps toward the parking garage when the splinter caught. Marissa had said she would text him when she landed in Chicago, But the client meeting she had mentioned, the 10 o'clock, had been canceled 2 days ago. He had told her about the cancellation over dinner. She had nodded, and yet she had just used it, freshly, as a reason to send him away as if the meeting still existed. It was a small thing. People forget cancellations. But Daniel was an architect, and architects notice when a load-bearing detail has been quietly changed. He stopped walking. He turned around. The security area at Denver International is arranged so that a person who has stepped aside near the food court can, without following, see travelers as they clear the checkpoint and disperse toward the gates. Daniel found a seat at a coffee kiosk with a clear line of sight, and he told himself he was only being cautious, only wanting to see her safely through, and he waited. Marissa cleared security. He watched her collect her carry-on from the belt, slip her shoes back on, and shoulder her bag. And then he watched her check her phone, smile, that same small private smile, and turn left. Chicago departed from Concourse B. From the gates on the right, Daniel had booked the flight. He knew the gate. He had confirmed it that morning out of habit. Marissa turned left toward Concourse A and walked with a lightness in her step that Daniel had not seen in years. A spring, an eagerness, the body language of someone walking toward something rather than away from something. She did not look back. Why would she? As far as she knew, her husband was already in the parking garage, dutifully driving to a meeting that did not exist. Daniel sat very still. The coffee kiosk hummed. A child somewhere was crying about a dropped toy, and Daniel Reyes, architect, quiet man, keeper of another person's pace for 9 years, felt the floor of his marriage tilt beneath him like a badly poured foundation. He did not chase her. That is the first thing to understand about Daniel. He was not a man who chased. He was a man who observed, who gathered, who understood a structure completely before he touched it. So he stayed in his seat, and he took out his phone, and he opened the airline app, and he began to learn. Marissa's frequent flyer number was linked to their shared account because she had insisted years ago that it was simpler to pool their miles. Daniel had never once logged in. He had never needed to. But he remembered the password because it was the password Marissa used for everything, the name of her childhood dog and the year she was born. And he had watched her type it 100 times. The account opened, and there, in plain digital text, was her itinerary. It was not Chicago. It was Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, departing at 8:40 that morning from Gate A-47, returning 6 days later. One passenger, Marissa Reyes. And beneath the reservation, linked by a shared confirmation code, because whoever had booked it had not been careful, had assumed no one would ever look, was a second name, Vincent Hale. Daniel knew the name. Of course, he knew the name. Vincent Hale was a real estate developer, a man Marissa had introduced him to at a fundraiser 18 months ago, a man with very white teeth and a very firm handshake who had called Daniel the artist in a tone that was not a compliment. Vincent Hale had, Daniel now recalled, complimented Marissa's dress with a specificity that had irritated him at the time and that he had dismissed as jealousy because Marissa had told him he was insecure, and he had believed her because believing Marissa was easier than the alternative. There would be no wedding in Chicago. There had never been a wedding in Chicago. Daniel closed the app. He did not cry. He would examine later why he did not cry, and he would decide that it was because a part of him had already known, had known for a long time, in the way you know a wall is failing before the crack appears. You feel the building shift, you sense the wrongness in the weight, and you tell yourself it is nothing until the day it is everything. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and he threw it away, and he walked out of the airport into the gray morning. But he did not drive home. He drove instead to his office, a small firm he had built from nothing, and he sat down at his desk, and he began, very calmly, to do what he had always done best. He began to understand the whole structure. Here is what 9 years of marriage had taught Daniel to overlook, and what one morning of clarity now forced him to see. He had married Marissa when he was 31 and she was 28. He had been at the time a mid-level associate at a large architecture firm, competent but unremarkable, and Marissa had been an event planner with expensive taste and a talent for making people feel that they had been chosen. She had chosen him. He had felt, for years afterward, that this was the great good fortune of his life, that a woman like Marissa, bright and social and effortlessly at the center of every room, had selected him, quiet Daniel, to stand beside her. He had not understood then that Marissa did not select people for who they were. She selected them for what they might become, and for how useful their becoming might be to her, because Daniel had become something. 2 years into the marriage, he had left the large firm and opened his own practice, a decision Marissa had opposed loudly, and then, when it began to succeed, claimed as her own idea. And it had succeeded, quietly, steadily, the way Daniel did everything. He had designed a civic library that won a regional award, then a medical campus. Then, 4 years ago, he had landed a contract to design a series of mixed-use developments for a client group that valued his refusal to cut corners, and that contract had made Daniel Reyes, without fanfare, a genuinely wealthy man. He had never told Marissa the full extent of it. This was not at first deception. It was habit, and it was a small self-protection he had never fully articulated even to himself. Early in their marriage, Marissa had spent money the way water finds the lowest point, instantly and without effort. She had run through his associate salary, then run through the first years of his firm's earnings, and Daniel, who had grown up poor and who understood money as something you built with rather than something you burned, had quietly begun to separate the accounts. The household money, the money Marissa saw and managed and spent, was a river he kept full and flowing. But the reservoir, the investments, the retained earnings of the firm, the ownership stakes, and 3 of the developments he had designed, taken in lieu of higher fees on the advice of a financial planner he had never mentioned to his wife, the reservoir Marissa knew nothing about. She thought she had married an artist who did well enough. She did not know she had married a man worth. On the morning she flew to Cabo San Lucas with Vincent Hale, a little over $11 million. And this is the irony that Daniel turned over in his hands that morning, alone in his office. For years, Marissa had made him feel small. She had corrected his clothes and his posture and his conversation at dinner parties. She had introduced him as, "My husband, he does buildings," in a tone that placed him 1 rung above the caterer. She had, he now allowed himself to remember, once told a friend, not knowing Daniel could hear, that she had settled, that she'd thought Daniel would go further than he had, and that a woman had to be practical about these things. She had believed she was the wealth in the marriage, the value, the one who had descended from a higher social altitude to lift him up, and she had spent 9 years subtly reminding him of the debt he owed her for it. She had no idea that she had been living the entire time inside a house whose true foundation she had never once inspected. Daniel opened a new document on his computer. At the top, out of an old architect's habit, he typed a single word: survey. Before you renovate a structure, you survey it. You find out what is actually holding it up, what is decorative, and what has been quietly rotting behind the walls. Over the next several hours, Daniel Reyes surveyed his marriage. He pulled the shared credit card statements, the ones Marissa assumed he never read because he had for years simply paid them. And now, knowing what to look for, he saw the shape of the affair rendered in charges. Hotel rooms in the city on nights Marissa had said she was at yoga retreats, restaurants he had never eaten at. A men's watch, purchased 11 months ago, that Daniel had never received and had never seen on any wrist, but had, he now realized, glimpsed once on Vincent Hale's at a charity gala where Marissa had insisted they make an appearance. She had bought her lover a watch with her husband's money and then dragged her husband to a party to admire it. He did not feel rage. Exactly. He felt the cold, clarifying focus he felt when a project he cared about was being threatened by someone else's carelessness. He felt like a man who has discovered that the contractor has been billing him for materials that were never installed. He picked up the phone and called two people. The first was his attorney, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Priya Venkatesan, who had handled his business contracts for 6 years and who listened to his summary without a single interruption before saying, quietly, "Daniel, I am going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Do you want to hurt her, or do you want to be free of her? Because those are two different strategies, and only one of them ends well for you." Daniel considered this for a long moment. Outside his window, the gray morning was burning off into a hard, clear blue. "I want to be free," he said, "but I want her to understand, exactly once, what she actually had. And then I want her gone. That," said Priya, "I can do cleanly." The second call was to his financial planner, to confirm what he already suspected, that the reservoir was entirely his. That because Marissa had insisted years ago on keeping her event planning income in her own separate accounts. Small vanity, a way of maintaining the fiction that she was independent, that she had not settled. She had inadvertently built the very wall that would now protect Daniel's fortune from her. Colorado is not a community property state. It divides marital property equitably, which is to say fairly, and fairness, Priya explained, would look very different for Marissa once a court understood the pattern of the household accounts, the affair funded from shared money, and the careful documented separation Daniel had maintained. "She thinks she's coming home to a husband she can manage," Priya said. "What she's coming home to is a very clear paper trail." Daniel spent the 6 days of Marissa's absence, not raging, not drinking, not calling her 40 times. He spent them working. He met with Priya twice. He gathered documents. He had a locksmith recommended by a friend, and he had the security system's access codes changed, and he moved certain irreplaceable things, his grandmother's drafting compass, the original sketches for the library that had launched him, the letters his father had written him before he died, into a safe deposit box. Because he understood that a person capable of a 6-day lie in a foreign country was capable of small vengeances too. And every day, at some point, his phone would light up with a text from Marissa, landed. "Flight was a nightmare, so tired. Wedding was beautiful. Wish you'd been here, but you know how you get at these things. Miss you. Bring wine. I'll cook when I'm back." Daniel read each one. He did not answer with anger. He answered, instead, with a warmth so measured it should have frightened her if she had been the kind of person who noticed such things. "Glad you landed safe," he wrote. "Take care of yourself. See you soon." Because Daniel had decided something in those 6 days. He had decided that he would not confront Marissa in a fury, would not scream, would not become, even for an hour, a version of himself he would be ashamed of later. He would instead do the far more devastating thing. He would let her walk back into her life exactly as she had left it, confident and unbothered, and he would let her show him, one more time, precisely who she was. And then, at the moment of her greatest comfort, he would simply, quietly, remove the floor. Marissa Reyes came home on a Monday evening, tanned and glowing, trailing the specific radiance of a woman who has spent 6 days being adored. Daniel watched her come through the door and had the strange doubled experience of seeing her as he had always seen her and seeing her for the first time, clearly. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful. And her beauty, he understood now, had functioned for years, like a well-designed facade on a poorly built structure, drawing the eye, discouraging inspection. "There you are," she said, dropping her bag. "God, I'm exhausted." The airport was a zoo. She kissed him lightly on the cheek. She smelled of a cologne that was not his. "Did you eat? I told you I'd cook, but honestly, I can barely stand." "I ate," Daniel said. "Sit down. You must be tired. Tell me about the wedding." And here is where Daniel gave Marissa the rope, gently, the way you offer a chair to someone who does not know they are about to be examined. She told him about the wedding. He had to admit, a talent for it. She invented a ceremony in a lakeside venue, a bride who cried, a drunken uncle, a band that played too loudly. She had prepared her lie the way she prepared everything, with an eye for the details that made it convincing. She had even, he noticed, bought a small gift, a scarf that she claimed she had picked up at a little shop near the hotel. And Daniel understood that the shop had been in Cabo San Lucas, that she had bought a cover story a size too small, and that she was now handing him the receipt of her own betrayal, wrapped in tissue paper. "That's a beautiful scarf," Daniel said. "What a thoughtful thing, to think of me while you were away." And Marissa smiled, pleased with herself, and had no idea that her husband was cataloging every word. They went to bed. Daniel lay awake in the dark beside the woman he had loved for 9 years, and he felt the last of his old life detach and float away, and in its place he felt something spacious and clean, like a room after the demolition of a wall you had always suspected was hiding damp. The next morning he asked her to dinner. "Just the two of us," he said. "Somewhere nice. I want to talk to you about something." Marissa, who loves somewhere nice, agreed at once. And here Daniel made a choice that Priya had questioned and then approved. He chose the restaurant at the top of the tallest building downtown, a glass-walled place where the whole city spread out beneath the diners like a map. He chose it because 2 of the buildings visible from those windows were buildings he had designed. He chose it because he wanted Marissa to be looking out at the actual physical evidence of the husband she had never bothered to see at the moment she finally understood him. He also quietly invited 2 other guests. They arrived at the restaurant at 7. Marissa wore a new dress. She was in a fine mood. She had spent the day being congratulated by friends on a wedding she had not attended, in a city she had not visited, and she moved through the world, buoyed by the frictionless success of her own deceptions. The waiter seated them at a window table. The city glittered. Marissa ordered a cocktail and settled in, and said, "So, what's this mysterious thing you wanted to talk about? You've been very sweet since I got back." "I have," Daniel agreed. "I've been thinking a lot while you were gone. About us, about the last 9 years, about what we've built." He said the word "we" with a gentleness that would, in retrospect, seem to her like a trap, though in the moment it seemed like tenderness. Marissa softened. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Danny," she said, "I know things haven't been perfect, but I do love you. You know that. And this small, easy lie, offered while her lover's cologne had not yet fully faded from her suitcase. This was the moment Daniel had been waiting for. He did not raise his voice. He turned his hand so that hers rested in his, and he looked at her with something that was almost kindness. And he said, "How was Cabo, Marissa?" The change in her face was a thing Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. It was not, at first, guilt. It was calculation, the rapid flickering assessment of a person deciding how much you know and how little she can admit. He watched her run the odds. He watched her decide to gamble. "What are you talking about?" she said, with a small, confused laugh. "I was in Chicago, at the wedding. I told you." "Vincent Hale," Daniel said, "flew home yesterday afternoon. You arrived separately today. I imagine you thought that was safer." He said it the way he might describe the specifications of a beam. "The scarf you gave me was purchased at a boutique in the Puerto Paraiso Mall. I looked it up. Lovely shop. Not, I think, in Chicago." Marissa withdrew her hand. Her face was doing something complicated. The beauty was still there, but behind it now was a cornered animal recalculating its position. And Daniel found that he felt, more than anything, a great tiredness. You went through my things, she said, pivoting instantly to attack, because attack had always worked before. You spied on me. That's what this is about. God, Daniel, you're paranoid. You've always been. I watched you at the airport, Daniel said quietly. You turned left. Chicago was to the right. I didn't go through anything, Marissa. You simply walked toward the truth, and I happened to be looking. She was silent. The city glittered behind her. I'm not going to yell at you, Daniel continued. I want you to understand that. I'm not going to make a scene, and I'm not going to beg, and I'm not going to spend one more minute of my life trying to be a man who is good enough for you, because I've realized something these past 6 days. I've realized that you never actually knew who you married. Don't be dramatic, Marissa said, but her voice had thinned. You told your friend Kara 3 years ago that you'd settled. Daniel watched this land. She had not known he'd heard it, and the color left her face. You've spent 9 years introducing me as the man who does buildings. You corrected my clothes and my grammar and my ambition. You spent my money on a watch for another man and then made me admire it at a party. And through all of it, you were certain, completely certain, that you were the prize. In this marriage that I was lucky. That whatever you did, I would stay. Because where would a man like me ever go? Daniel, so let me tell you what you actually had. And now, Daniel leaned forward, and his voice did not rise, but it acquired a weight that made the surrounding tables go quiet. You had a husband, worth $11 million. The number sat in the air between them. Marissa laughed, once a reflexive, disbelieving sound. You don't have. I own equity in 3 developments, including that one, Daniel said, nodding toward the window, toward a tower of lit glass standing over the city. And that one. I took ownership stakes instead of fees. 4 years ago, on the advice of a financial planner you never knew I had. The library that won the award, that opened doors you never bothered to walk through because you'd already decided what I was. The money in the household, accounts, the money you managed and spent and thought was the whole of me. That was the runoff, Marissa. That was the overflow. You spent your whole marriage standing at the edge of a reservoir and drinking from the gutter and telling everyone how thirsty you were. Marissa stared at him. And Daniel watched a new expression climb onto her face, one he had never seen there in 9 years, because he had never given her a reason for it. He watched her begin to panic. You should have talked to me, she said, and the pivot was almost impressive, the way she reassembled herself. If I'd known, Daniel, we could have. This is a marriage we tell each other things. If you'd only. You're right, Daniel said. In a marriage, you tell each other things, which is why I ask you here tonight to tell you something. He signaled, subtly, to the maître d' at the edge of the room. I've asked 2 people to join us. I hope you don't mind. Marissa turned. Crossing the restaurant toward their table was Priya Venkatesan, in a crisp charcoal suit, carrying a slim leather folio, and, beside her, to Marissa's visible horror, was a woman. Marissa clearly recognized a woman with the same white teeth as Vincent Hale, the same expensive posture, Vincent's wife, because Daniel had done his surveying thoroughly, and one of the things he had learned was that Vincent Hale had a wife of his own. A woman named Eleanor, who had, until 4 days ago, believed her husband was in Cabo San Lucas at a real estate conference. Marissa, Daniel said, this is my attorney, and I believe you've met Eleanor Hale, though perhaps not formally. Eleanor reached out to me after I contacted her husband's office to confirm some travel dates. We had a very informative conversation. Eleanor Hale looked at Marissa the way you look at a stain on something you loved. She did not sit down. She did not need to. I only wanted to see her face, Eleanor said to Daniel, not to Marissa. Thank you. That's all. And she turned and walked out. And the sound of her heels on the marble was the loudest thing in the room. Priya sat. She placed the leather folio on the table and opened it with the unhurried precision of a woman who has done this many times. "Mrs. Reyes," she said pleasantly, "these are the documents initiating your divorce. Einda. You'll find everything transparent and, I think, fair, because your husband kept scrupulous records of the household accounts and his personal assets, and because you maintained separate accounts of your own, the division is quite clean. What you brought into the marriage you keep, what you spent, and what Mr. Reyes built, the equity, the firm, the reservoir, as he calls it, is legally, provably, and entirely his. I'd encourage you to have your own attorney review these, but I'll be honest with you. As a professional courtesy, there isn't much to argue about." Marissa's hands had begun to tremble. "This isn't. You can't just 9 years, Daniel. I gave you 9 years. You gave me 9 years of contempt, dressed as love," Daniel said. And, for the first time, there was something raw beneath the calm, a single honest wound showing through. "And I let you, because I was afraid that the man I actually wasn't enough to keep a woman like you. That was my mistake, not the money, the hiding. I hid because some part of me believed you were right about me, that I was small, that I was lucky to have you, that if you ever saw all of me, you'd only find more reasons to be disappointed." He shook his head. "I don't believe that anymore. Vincent Hale taught me the last thing I needed to know. Not about you. About me. That I'd rather be alone and whole than married and disappearing." The dinner did not last much longer. There was very little left to say. Marissa tried, in the way that people who have always won try, several more angles. Tears, then accusation, then a sudden brittle attempt at seduction, so transparent that Daniel felt only pity, and each one broke against the plain fact of the documents on the table and the plainer fact of a man who had finally stopped auditioning for his own life. She left the restaurant alone. Daniel paid the bill. He sat for a while afterward at the window, looking out at the 2 towers he had designed, lit up against the dark, full of other people's lives. Priya sat with him in a comfortable silence, and then, before she left, said the only personal thing she had ever said to him in 6 years. "You were kind to her tonight," she observed, "kinder than she earned. I want you to know that people noticed that. It cost you nothing, and it says everything." The weeks that followed were, on the surface, quiet. But beneath the surface, a great deal of settling occurred, the way a building settles onto a proper foundation after the props are removed. The divorce proceeded exactly as Priya had predicted, cleanly, because the truth, when it is documented, does not require argument. Marissa hired an attorney of her own, an aggressive man who wrote several aggressive letters, and Priya answered each of them with a single page and a stack of records, and after the third exchange the aggressive letters stopped. There was nothing to fight for. Marissa left the marriage with the separate savings she had always guarded, which turned out, in a final small irony, to be far less than she had believed and far less than she had led her friends to think, because a woman who lives lavishly on someone else's money does not save much of her own. Vincent Hale's story unspooled in a manner that had nothing to do with Daniel at all, which was, Daniel thought, the purest form of justice, the kind that requires no revenge because a person has already, invisibly, been detonating their own life for years. Eleanor Hale, it emerged, had her own attorney and her own patients and a prenuptial agreement that Vincent had once insisted upon, believing it would protect him, and that now closed around him like a trap. The affair with Marissa had not been his first. It had been, Eleanor decided, his last. Vincent Hale lost a great deal that autumn, and Daniel read about it months later in a business article about a stalled development, and felt nothing at all, which he took as a good sign, the sign of a wound properly closed. Marissa did not vanish quietly. At first she called Daniel twice. The first call was rage. The second, some weeks later, was something worse. A small, real, frightened voice on the line at 11 at night, asking whether he had ever loved her, whether any of it had been real. And Daniel, who could have been cruel and chose not to be, told her the truth. "I loved you completely," he said. "For a long time. I loved you when you didn't deserve it and after I should have stopped. That was real. What wasn't real was the version of me you married in your head, the man you thought you'd settled for. He never existed. You were married to someone you never met. And that isn't only your fault, Marissa. It's mine, too. I let you not meet me. I'm sorry for that. I'm not sorry for anything else." She did not call again after that. Daniel hoped in a distant way that she might one day become a person capable of seeing the people right in front of her. But that was her building to raise or leave in ruins, and he was no longer the architect of it. As for Daniel himself, the changes were slower and deeper. He kept the house at first and then sold it, because a house where you have spent 9 years shrinking is not a house you can grow in. He bought instead an old warehouse near the river, a raw, beautiful ruin of brick and light. And he renovated it himself on weekends with his own hands, designing a home for a man he was only beginning to meet. He put his grandmother's drafting compass on the desk where he could see it. He hung his father's letters, framed, in the hall. He filled the space with evidence of who he actually was, and he stopped hiding the reservoir. And he was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely visible to himself. His firm grew. He took on 2 young architects and taught them the thing he had nearly forgotten, that the strength of a structure is never in its facade, that a beautiful front hiding a rotten frame will always, always fail, and that the truest, most enduring buildings are the ones where the bones and the surface tell the same honest story. He was, they said, an unusually patient teacher. And roughly a year after the morning, he watched his wife turn left toward a gate that was not hers. Daniel stood again in the departures hall at Denver International, this time alone, this time carrying only his own single bag, this time flying to a conference where he was, for the first time, a keynote speaker. Invited to tell a room full of people how he did them. He stood at the security line and felt, unexpectedly, a wave of gratitude. Not for the betrayal. He would never be grateful for the betrayal, but for the clarity it had forced, the way a demolition, brutal in the moment, clears the ground for something better built. He thought of Marissa turning left, and how he had, in that instant, been given the one gift she never meant to give him, the sight of his own life, honestly, from the outside, in time to save it. He went through security. He collected his bag, and when he reached the concourse, Daniel Reyes turned right, toward his gate, toward the flight he had actually booked, toward the life that was actually his. And he did not look back, because there was nothing behind him worth turning around for, and everything ahead worth walking toward. So let me leave you with the thing this story taught me, the thing I most wanted you to stay for. The people who make you feel small are almost never measuring your true size. They are measuring the version of you that you agreed to become in front of them. And the day you stop agreeing, the day you stand up straight and let yourself be fully seen, is the day you find out how much you were carrying all along unspent in a reservoir no one else ever bothered to look for. Daniel's worth was never $11 million. That was just the number that finally made his wife's face go pale. His real worth was in the dignity he refused to trade away, even at his lowest, even when it would have been easier to hide. Here is my question for you, and I truly want your answer in the comments. Have you ever hidden your true self to keep the peace with someone who never deserved that sacrifice? And if you had one chance to let them finally see you clearly, what would you want them to understand? Tell me below and tell me where you're watching from. If this story moved you, take a moment to like it and subscribe, because I have more stories exactly like this one coming. Stories about the quiet people who were underestimated right up until the moment they stopped allowing it. Stay with me. The next one is a good one.